Welcome to the deep dive. Often we see these big geopolitical events flare up, and they seem to come out of nowhere, right? Like
Right,
isolated incidents.
right. Just suddenly on the news.
Exactly. But what if one of the most intense relationships, the U.S.-Iran dynamic, isn't like that at all?
What if it's connected?
Yeah, what if it's actually part of a much longer game, a carefully sort of orchestrated plan?
Hmm.
That's pretty much the really provocative argument that Professor Jeffrey Sachs makes in his article, Trump just started Netanyahu's dream war with Iran.
It's a strong title.
It is. And our mission today is really to dive deep into Sachs's perspective here. It's challenging, no doubt. We want to give you a shortcut to understanding this incredibly complex situation by, pulling out the most important insights he offers.
And what Sachs presents, it really is a counter-narrative. I mean,
Yeah.
he argues that the U.S. airstrike on Iran, the one ordered by then President Trump,
Yeah.
it wasn't just a standalone thing.
Not spontaneous.
Not at all. Instead, he lays out this case that it's the result, the culmination of what he actually calls 30 years of geopolitical manipulation.
40 years. Wow.
Yeah. And he largely points the finger at Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Okay.
But also, and this is crucial to his argument, significantly helped along by what Sachs identifies as a powerful Israel lobby right here in the United States.
So he's naming specific actors and influences.
Absolutely. And we're going to really unpack how Sachs backs this up. How does he support this, frankly, sweeping claim? We need to look at how he defines things like geopolitical manipulation and the specific role he sees for the Israel lobby.
And his tone isn't neutral, is it?
Oh, not at all. He frames Trump's decision very critically, calls it a dreadful mistake, and even dangerously delusional. So that sets the critical perspective right from the start.
Okay. So let's talk about that 30-year campaign Sachs alleges. What does he say Netanyahu's goal was during all that time?
Well, according to Sachs, the primary driver for Netanyahu for decades has been to draw the U.S. military into confronting Iran directly.
Why Iran specifically?
Sachs argues it's multi-layered. Part of it, he claims, is using the supposed threat of Iranian nuclear weapons as a kind of pretext.
A pretext for what?
To undermine governments in the region that Israel sees as hostile or as obstacles, primarily obstacles to its own goals regarding the Palestinians. He links it directly to preventing a viable Palestinian state.
So the nuclear issue is presented as the main thing, but Sachs says the deeper goal relates to the Palestinians and regional dominance.
That's the core of his argument, yes.
Yeah.
That the focus on Iran serves these other, perhaps less publicly stated strategic aims for Netanyahu's vision of Israel's security and position.
And how does the Israel lobby, as Sachs calls it, fit into this picture?
Sachs portrays this lobby as, well, incredibly influential in shaping U.S. foreign policy to align with these specific Israeli objectives. He doesn't see it as just happening by chance.
He's suggesting direct influence on policy decisions.
Yes, very directly. He argues that this influence was pivotal not just concerning Iran, but also in pushing for U.S. involvement or certain stances regarding Iraq, Syria, Libya. Basically aligning U.S. actions across the Middle East with the goals he attributes to Netanyahu.
That's a significant claim about the power dynamics in Washington.
It is. And it's central to his explanation for why the U.S. would, in his view, follow this path, culminating in that airstrike under Trump.
But Sachs also presents a different view of Iran itself, doesn't he? Sort of pushes back against the common portrayal.
He absolutely does. He makes a point of describing Iran as, an ancient civilization, a complex society, not just the caricature we sometimes get.
And their intentions regarding nuclear weapons, for instance.
Sachs argues that Iran has, at various points, actually sought more normalized relations and has expressed a disinterest in developing nuclear weapons. He points specifically to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal.
Right, the deal the U.S. pulled out of.
Exactly. He framed the dismantling of the JCPOA, largely pushed for by Netanyahu and supported by the lobby groups he mentions, as a key part of this long-term strategy to prevent normalization and keep Iran isolated and under pressure.
So he sees the deal's collapse not as a failure of Iran, but as a success for those seeking confrontation.
Precisely. He presents it as removing a diplomatic path that Iran was, in fact, adhering to, according to international inspectors at the time.
This connects to another point Sachs apparently makes about the U.S. history of, covert actions and regime change.
Right. He touches on that history, the CIA's involvement in overthrowing governments, like Mossadegh in Iran back in '53.
Does he think it works, this strategy?
He's deeply skeptical. His view seems to be that these attempts at regime change, especially from the outside, rarely achieve their stated goals and often lead to Instability and unintended consequences. Blowback, essentially.
So applying that to Iran, he argued trying to force change wouldn't work or would be counterproductive.
That seems to be his implication, that it ignores the internal dynamics and history of the country and risks further conflict rather than resolution.
And how does he characterize Israel's strategy more broadly, beyond just lobbying in the U.S.?
Sachs describes what he sees as a kind of dual strategy. On one hand, covert actions, including assassinations of Iranian scientists and officials.
Which have been reported over the years.
Yes. And on the other hand, this sustained effort to pull the U.S. into larger proxy wars or even direct conflict, again, framing Iran as the primary threat.
But you mentioned earlier he ties it all back to the Palestinian issue. How does that remain central in his view?
Because ultimately, Sachs argues that the core unresolved issue fueling so much regional instability is the situation of the roughly 8 million Palestinians living under occupation or as refugees.
So for Sachs, dealing with Iran is almost a distraction from the root cause.
Or rather, a strategy to manage the consequences of not dealing with the root cause. He suggests that as long as the Palestinian issue isn't addressed justly, Israel will continue to perceive threats from neighbors, including Iran or its proxies, and will seek U.S. backing to counter them.
Does he offer a solution then, if this is the problem?
He does. He strongly advocates for a two-state solution, based on the 1967 borders, as the fundamental key to unlocking regional peace.
A long-discussed but elusive goal.
Very much so. But Sachs presents it not just as a matter of justice for Palestinians, but as essential for Israel's own long-term security and for stabilizing the entire region, including relations with Iran. He thinks it would remove the primary driver of conflict.
And there's a warning in his analysis too, right, about where this could all lead.
A very stark warning. He raises the specter of nuclear escalation. If diplomacy fails, if confrontations continue, he emphasizes the need for disarmament and a return to diplomacy urgently.
Okay, that really sets a powerful stage for our deep dive, laying out the stakes. So if we try to distill Sachs's core argument, just pull it all together, what's the main takeaway he wants us, the listener, to grasp?
I think from his perspective, the fundamental thing to understand is that this conflict with Iran, particularly the U.S. involvement, isn't some spontaneous thing. It's not accidental.
Right. It's what he calls that meticulously orchestrated geopolitical strategy.
Exactly. And he draws these really strong lines, connecting it back to what he sees as Israel's internal political drivers, particularly under Netanyahu.
Its long-standing goal, in his view, of suppressing Palestinian sovereignty.
And crucially, the willingness of the U.S., across different administrations perhaps, to align with those strategic goals, influenced heavily by the lobbying efforts he details.
And another really critical piece is how Sachs argues Iran has been, well, fundamentally misrepresented in a lot of Western discussion.
Yeah, he consistently brings up their diplomatic efforts, their stated reluctance, as he sees it, to escalate things. He really pushes back on the idea of them as purely an aggressor.
So his call to action then, for people listening, for U.S. citizens.
It's pretty clear. He urges people to actively push for diplomacy, for peace negotiations, to really question the narrative driving towards conflict and try to avert what he warns could easily become, America's next endless war.
Avoid another endless war.
Yeah. And this whole analysis, it really prompts us, I think, to consider a pretty fundamental question, doesn't it? If these kinds of long-term, multi-decade strategies, like the one Sachs alleges, can actually unfold sort of beneath the surface of the daily news cycle, well, what responsibility do we have, as informed observers?
Responsibility to do what?
To actually look beyond the immediate crisis, the latest headline, and make an effort to critically examine those deeper historical currents, the political forces that might really be shaping our world. It's a lot to think about.